Image is a podcast of Redemption Church located in Huntington, West Virginia for the purpose of equipping believers to fully engage culture in a theologically faithful way.
Hello everyone, Brandon here. So I just wanted to make a note that the podcast you're about to listen to, I recorded immediately after the Palm Sunday sermon that Rory gave. This was quite a few weeks ago, and things got busy with me at work, and so I'm just now had the availability to edit and release it. So bit of a delay on that. So when you hear me reference the Palm Sunday sermon being last Sunday, that's what happened. So I apologize for that, but hope you enjoy it. Hello everyone. So given the week, you'd probably would expect to have a podcast episode that's maybe focused on Good Friday or Easter Sunday. But I felt compelled to put this together, after this past Sunday's sermon that Rory gave, and essentially the whole concept that I wanted to cover today is basically the biological basis for why it is important for us to protect children. And so if you weren't at Sunday or this past Palm Sunday service, I would definitely recommend you listen to that. And, one of the key things that Rory was focused on was, the importance of children. And that wasn't necessarily the main focus of the sermon, but it was definitely one of the high points. And it also correlated well with the fact that it was the fifth Sunday. There's a lot of kids in the church. Even my own, kids benefited from that. So anyways, one of the things that we can start with is just one of the, key statements that Jesus made that really, highlights the importance of this. So Matthew 18, verse 6, and this is from the NIV. If anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me, to stumble, it will be better for them to have a large millstone hung around their neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea. And that is a very serious thing for Jesus to say. So the fact that, if we were to mislead a child, if we were to mistreat a child, because mistreating them is certainly misleading them, it will be very bad for us. And why is it that Jesus uses such extreme language? And so, part of my job is understanding how the brain connects to behavior. So, the whole concept of the brain dictates our motivated behavior. And, thinking about this, I basically have the conclusion that in this, Jesus, this was definitely not an exaggeration, in a way that, he was ahead of our way of thinking. And so basically I want to talk about, three different components of what we know about how different things that happen during childhood are not just predictive of negative, life consequences, but, how they may, play a role in that. So essentially, three things I want to cover today are ACE, adverse childhood events, and basically how adverse things that occur during childhood are not just predictive, but they can put a person, on the trajectory of different types of negative consequences. So increased risk for, homelessness, mental disorders, drug dependence issues. I also want to talk about how, even we as parents, there's a generational aspect. So there's a biological and genetic aspect of some of the things that we do actually will directly pass on to our children. And this is, in a way, sometimes a biological basis for generational sins. And then the last thing I want to talk about is a psychological theory called the elephant chain theory. I'll actually start with that one first because I feel like it's a little bit easier to kind of, sink your teeth in if you're not, because the other components I may go into some biology, and that may be a snooze fest for some of you. So we'll start with something that may be a little bit more tangible. So two things can help surround the idea of what this theory is. So the elephant chain theory is essentially a concept of learned helplessness. And so what is learned helplessness? It's a psychological theory describing a state where individuals, people, they're exposed repeatedly to uncontrollable or negative events, and then they come to believe that they have no power to influence those outcomes. So essentially what happens is they get used to the fact that they're in this negative scenario, and they don't question it, they don't fight against it, they don't try to leave it. And so this, you may have experienced this, or you may know someone that has experience with these things. So why is it called the elephant chain theory? So I don't know how often you guys have may have gone to a circus or some area where the elephants aren't free ranging like a lot of our modern day zoos. So elephants, when they're babies, with the old school way that circuses were run, and so they would take this little teeny tiny, well, not teeny tiny, but tiny for an elephant, and they would use that to chain up the baby elephants. And the interesting thing is that the chains never changed in size. So the elephants will grow up, they become adults, and if they wanted to, they can snap that chain easily, without even exerting, 2% of their maximal strength. But they get used to the fact that as a child, they had this chain. It constrained them, it constricted them, and they couldn't break it. And then their mind gets stuck with that idea. So as soon as the adult elephants have that same chain put on them, they don't even, really think to fight that. And so the same thing happens to us as people. Another great way of understanding this is, people that have electric fences for their dogs. And a lot of those scenarios, they'll put in the fence, and then they'll have something attached to the collar. So when the dog, goes close to the perimeter, there'll be a buzzing or even like a shock that will occur. And in a lot of those scenarios, they'll train the dog to understand this is the perimeter, and eventually they won't use the shock collar because the dog will know what the boundaries are. And so the dog will learn, okay, this is the area, and if I go past this area, there's something bad will happen. And then they'll continue to believe that even when they don't have that thing that will shock them on their collar or their neck. So the same thing can happen to us as humans. And the most common things are when, if a child hears the phrase, you're worthless, you will never fill in the blank. You will never amount to, anything, or you will never accomplish this, or even sometimes just repeatedly hearing, this thing is not for you, even though, maybe, so you can fill in multiple different scenarios. A child will, want to, study math. And so I grew up in a farming town, and I remember, I gravitated towards math, biology, chemistry, all that kind of stuff. And then, because it's a farming town, like a lot of people just, a lot of my peers or even some of the adults in the area just saw that as like a useless pursuit. And so they would say, why are you doing this? And then I questioned that. And so I honestly didn't even think I could do what I do as a job until someone basically, convinced me, like, when I was a senior in high school. So, the phrases and the words that we can use with the children in our lives, or our own children, our nieces, or our nephews, that could put a limiter on them. So a child that is told you're worthless may become an adult who never tries to risk anything. Because what's the point? Because, people have told me this is my lane, I better stay into it. But then there's also the flip side. Children that are exposed to chaos, they become adults that they normalize dysfunction. And great examples are, unfortunately, children that have grown up in households that, have, abuse. So whether it's physical abuse, kind of like mental and emotional abuse, they learn that that is normal. They'll do that to the people around them. Or what is also more likely is that when that is done to them, they think that it's normal. They actually will gravitate towards those types of people. And so, I have a lot of friends that are psychiatrists or psychologists. There's a lot of, them that are in the church as well. But some of my friends that as we were kind of going through our parallel graduate, and professional school careers, they would talk about different types of scenarios. And one that was very common, that they would occur when we were going through our training were the types of people that if they grew up in a house that exhibited abuse, they actually gravitated towards relationships like that. So if you're a guy that grew up in a household that had a lot of abuse, you would actually gravitate towards a girlfriend or a spouse that would, tend to, use that kind of abuse, whether it's physical, emotional, mental. So anyways, okay, just to kind of sum this segment out, because I kind of went on a rant there for a bit, but the things that we say, these are just words, can even be a limiter for the children in our life. And so it's very important that we use our words appropriately. Well, it's for this reason why we have verses like Proverbs 12, 18. Here I'm using the NIV again. So the words of the reckless pierce like swords, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. And so here we have the duality that's common in Proverbs. So you have one side and then the other, the bad side and the good side. The bad side is our words can, our reckless words, they can pierce like swords, and that can pierce the heart, the soul, the mentality, and it's really important for us to be wise. And as this verse says, if we are wise, we can bring healing. And sometimes when we take in the context of how our words can impact our children, the children in our lives, the children in our environment, we never know what they are experiencing. And sometimes it if you feel called to basically say something that's wise, uplifting, empowering, it would be good to do that, because when it comes to children, a lot of times they just want to be acknowledged. They want to be listened to, even if they can talk so fast you can't understand them. Okay, so we went on a bit about the elephant chain theory. This is something that there's books about this. There's whole sorts of books, courses on it, and you can go on and on. But the key is our words are important. We can limit, we can severely debilitate children, or we can empower them. And the way that we pour into them with our words and our spoken language, and our affection, that is a key predictor for their potential growth and their health. Okay. So going back to, I mentioned at the top, ACE, so adverse childhood experiences. And so this basically, this was, so I remember this originated, so there was a peer-reviewed scientific article. This was like the American Journal of Preventive Medicine. And so the whole idea is that it's a study on the relationship of childhood abuse and household dysfunction to many of the leading causes of death in adults. So basically it looked at what may have happened during childhood, and then correlated that to adverse events that happen into adulthood. And this was one of the first studies that coined the phrase ACE of adverse childhood experiences. And this was done in like 1998. So before I even started developing my professional interest in brain health and neuroscience. So the whole background is that there was an idea of a relationship of health risk behavior and disease in adulthood due to childhood emotional, physical, or sexual abuse and household dysfunction during childhood. So household dysfunction is a wide umbrella, can be a lot of different things, but one of the key things is also childhood homelessness. So basically, this had like 14,000 individuals that were tracked from childhood up into adulthood, and what they found is that there was what's called a graded relationship. So basically, graded as in the number of categories of childhood adverse exposures or adverse events, there was a stepwise increase in health risk behaviors and diseases. And so, when it comes to health risk behaviors, really, without going into all the details of the study, putting up tables and figures and things like that. So a lot of these health risk behaviors are different types of mental health issues. So this could be schizophrenia, dissociation disorders. But the key thing is that some of these disorders are, largely due to another result that was found, is that depending upon the number of childhood adverse events, there is also a stepwise increase in the risk for drug dependence, and this could be alcohol, tobacco. Those were, pretty much in almost all scenarios, or what we call polysubstance, so it's more than one drug, typically alcohol and tobacco. But then also what we call the stronger reinforcers, so cocaine, methamphetamine, opioids, things of that nature. Synthetic drugs like, psychedelics, ecstasy, MPTP. But the important thing is when it comes to the mental health disorders that I kind of mentioned, like schizophrenia. So some drugs are also a precursor for some of those mental health disorders, because some of the drugs, methamphetamine is a great example, they have a long-term impact on actually degrading parts of the brain. So, when you think about, too much of a good thing will burn you out, right? A drug like methamphetamine actually creates a toxic environment in the brain. So that will degrade neurons. If you degrade cells, that will also lead to some weird biology, and a lot of those would be, different, long story short, different types of mental health disorders. So anyways, so this was the first study that did that, and it's been really like a whole area of research and science in the psychology, psychiatry, motivated behavior fields, and over time this just got stronger, more and more evidence that the ACE scores are predictors of depression, substance misuse and abuse, suicide, or even homelessness, because when you think about the people that will tend to gravitate towards issues of drug dependence, issues of mental health, it's harder to maintain relationships, maintain jobs, then you're at a higher predicted incidence of homelessness. But also, because of one of the underlying results is also stress, anxiety. Stress and anxiety have a correlation with heart disease, so then even higher ACE scores are predictive of cardiovascular disease, things like congestive heart failure. So there's so many negative health consequences that were actually predicted by modeling ACE scores. It's a clear indication, and when we think about protecting children and why Jesus would say this is so important, it's because there's so many different negative consequences that come from events that are tied to the early childhood period. Okay. This is where I was thinking about going into the kind of like the neuroscience side, because a lot of these, so why is it that a person is higher risk for drug dependence? It's really tied to dopamine, and the one thing I'll just say, just to kind of make it short, is that dopamine is the neurotransmitter that's released. So if a person is doing something that feels good, this could be anything from eating, really good food. So like, a lot of us will get together for families this weekend. We'll have an Easter dinner. Sometimes we'll have some of our favorites. Growing up, my grandma would always make key lime pie. That's so good. You will definitely get a strong dopamine spike with that. So essentially one of the things that happens is, they've determined that individuals that have a childhood or a series of childhood events that are adverse, or they have a high A score, is their dopamine system is dysregulated. So typically, we would get a dopamine spike for natural rewards, like, if a child is hugged by their parent, a parent hugs their child, or even seeing your best friend, you get these dopamine spikes that reward you. And, the natural process is also to, community is important. I know that that's another thing that we can pick up from the Bible. And I think, our brain is trying to tell us that by giving these feel good sensations that we're with people. It's also tied into something called oxytocin, but I don't want to complicate it. So anyways, so for the individuals that have these high A scores, they have a deficit of dopamine. So things that should feel good don't feel good. And so that's basically a process called anhedonia. So, they can have some really yummy food and they don't really get a robust dopamine spike. They can see a person that is a family member, and if they were to embrace them, they don't get as much of a dopamine spike. And so sometimes those individuals are at a higher risk because they're not used to having, kind of that reward or motivation signal. And if they were to expose themselves to something like, especially a strong drug like cocaine or methamphetamine, the change in their dopamine signal would be altered so drastically, it makes it hard to say no to that on the second or third exposure. And that's usually when the problem comes. Like, if you can have it and then stay away from it, there's a chance that you can avoid the dependence aspect. But then if you go back for the second or third time, that becomes much more reinforced. And so that's one reason why, people that have these adverse childhood events, may be at a higher risk for drug dependence. And then once that becomes a problem, then there's a more direct pathway for the other issues that we talked about, like, mental health issues, and then also when it comes to homelessness. Okay, so that's something that we can go on for a very long time, but I'm going to stop right there because the next thing I want to talk about is there is a potential generational aspect of this as well. So the greatest, the strongest example is, I'm just going to stick to what I'm strong at, and that's, drug dependence. And so the things that we do as adults can also be directly passed on to our progeny. So a great example is when it comes to high levels of intake of stronger, illicit substances. So here I'll go to the cocaine, methamphetamine, or opioids arena. So we know that whether you're a mother or a father, your genetic material, by that I mean for men, your sperm, women, your eggs, the exposure to different types of drugs will actually change that genetic material. So for a man, this is true for nicotine, it's true for cocaine, it's true for different types of opioids, that, high levels of intake, and, this is something we're still figuring out, what is high level, what is sufficient. But a male sperm will be changed, that will then get passed on to, the children. So same thing can happen with women. So there are changes that can occur. Typically, the strong for women, it's mostly tied to the period of pregnancy, because anything you take in, alcohol or any drug, will pass into the placenta, and your bloodstream is your developing child's bloodstream, and so there's a direct effect that's there. But anyways, So you have a paternal effect and a maternal effect. And so different things can cause an increased risk in your progeny, so in your children. So a person that is, using tobacco or using or high levels of alcohol. So there's a great difference between, casual drinking versus binge drinking. So, you know, there are, some people consider it normal to have a six pack every single day of the year. And so there's a wide range. But anyways, so studies show that a person that is, alcohol dependent and is doing this, while they are either, impregnating their spouse or their female partner, or if the female is doing this during development, that risk passes on to the child. So there's a reason why there's family lines where alcohol dependence is a struggle, because the developing child, their brain will be altered so that when they reach of age of trying alcohol for their first time, their brain is already primed for that. So there's a generational aspect of the things that we can do. It's not just drugs, but it's also different types of things like stress. So, the easiest way to kind of, I guess you can say, measure stress between one person to another is just using cortisol levels. So people that have elevated cortisol levels, they have, I would say above average anxiety, above average stress. They tend to have children that have higher levels of cortisol, higher levels of anxiety, higher levels of stress. And so there is a biological basis that kind of explains the concept of, I don't want to say generational sins, but we'll say generational issues. And that's something that is, now there's a different type of, or a distinct type of treatment-based science or intervention-based science, as into, for couples or for adults that struggle with specific issues, dealing with them on an intervention basis, just to kind of like not to make sure it's not passed on to their children. So anyways, okay. So in this, the thing I want to reinforce is that Jesus, his warning aligns with multiple layers of what we experience. So one is the spiritual aspect, that, children matter deeply to God, and we can tell that just based upon, what the way that he speaks about them. There's also the psychological side, where, we know that early beliefs will shape a person's identity. And that's why we want to raise our children right. We want to make sure they have the right foundation, so that as they navigate through the world, they can have the correct lens and the correct worldview. But we also need to understand that our biology also can dictate our behavior. And over time, the scientific connection between how the brain is directly controlling our motivated behavior, it gets stronger. I'm biased because it's part of my job, but I would argue that over time it's getting stronger and stronger. So our biology will dictate our behavior, and so if things are occurring in which, at an early childhood point, your biology is being altered, that will change your behavior, and that's something we also need to consider as we need to protect this. So so we started with the verse from Matthew, and I guess the question is, what if the millstone wasn't just about judgment, but what if it was about, the weight of what we set in motion? So, it's a gray area to say, like, how do we mislead a child? Because, sometimes we act in the way that we were brought up, and sometimes, the things we may do we think are right, but maybe they're close to right, but not. But if they're close to right, how does that impact the youth around us? But the good thing is, while all this, this stuff I've talked about, it may paint like a really negative picture that, any little thing that we can do can negatively, alter the trajectory of a child. We also have to, rest on the fact that there is, well, I don't want we can simplify this as we use a phrase called neuroplasticity. So there's the brain is very flexible, and a great example of this is just there's so many cases of how children can be resilient. So we've talked about how different types of adverse events can steer a child towards the wrong direction, but we've also seen the events where a child can be in these negative situations and still become naturally great human beings. And part of that is because there is sometimes a protective element of things can happen. Since we're talking about the biology of this, biology has a way of trying to resist changes and return to a set point, homeostasis. So we also talked about in the Proverbs verse, the word of the wise can be healing. So there's the fact that the environment or the people around the children that we're kind of talking about, they can bring healing into the relationship or into their lives. And sometimes it's not, the wise words of adults, but it's the words of their peers. I feel very blessed that our boys have a lot of good young friends, and I'm not saying that they're all wise, because as Rory said, children by nature are sinners and they do some crazy things. But I see that there's a lot of kids in our church. They have good hearts, and that's something that gives me a lot of faith. And so speaking of faith, is the fact that that one thing that we can put into their lives that can be protective is faith and the teachings of Jesus. The concepts of grace, the concepts of redemption. Even if we, the parents, do something wrong, there's grace for us. Even if the child, they themselves, do something wrong, there's grace and redemption for them. And so I think these are very strong protective factors. But because I'm speaking to a church audience, this is something that's really preaching to the choir. So it's just reinforcing the idea that no matter what we do that may be not sufficient or not enough, or maybe we did the wrong thing, and when it comes to rearing the children in our lives, that there is grace for that.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, you can hear more of Image on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast at, or at redemptionwv.com/image, where you can also find any resources mentioned in our podcast and links to follow us on social media. And you can join the conversation by contacting us with any questions, feedback, or topic suggestions. Also, please rate our podcast and write a review at wherever you get your podcast, and that will help us ensure that this content gets to more people.